What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to a newer series on the channel. What if a serial killer reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman? This story will follow the life of Joseph Knox, one of the most prolific and well-known serial killers on the planet. A person considered so demented and maniacal that even trying to reason with him was considered a waste of time. A man so far gone that he seemingly didn't deserve any pity even on his deathbed. So why would a man like him receive a second chance? And why did the world around him seem so familiar? This story takes place in an alternate Naruto universe, so expect some changes when it comes to Madara's ultimate plan, and aliens also don't exist in this world. So if you enjoy a different take on the Naruto universe, support me by giving the video a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave comments down below for the next part. Thank you very much. Enjoy! It was a sunny day in Florida. A perfect day to go out on the beach, a perfect day to have fun with your friends, a perfect day to do whatever you wanted. But not everyone enjoyed that freedom. There were people that had no choice but to sit in a dark room contemplating their lives. Joseph Knox was one of them, and he wasn't there by choice. No, he had finally been caught. From a young age, he had always loved to see how other living beings bled, to see the light get snuffed out from their eyes. It was a strange thing, and he knew that it wasn't right. But the rush he felt whenever a little bird fell from its nest, or the calmness of mind he gained from seeing rabbits being hunted down by hawks, it was cathartic. His parents could have been described as uninvolved, as they had abandoned him not long after his birth. He was an orphan, and no one truly wanted to give him a home. Maybe it was due to his gaze that sometimes managed to creep out most of the people near him. Or maybe it was simply the vibe he gave off, which made people behave strangely around him. But a foster house wasn't all that bad. No one cared about him, and he cared about no one else besides himself. That was how he was brought up, and day after day, his desires grew more and more out of control. There was no one there to help him deal with that. He had no one near him that could understand his thoughts. So, at some point, he stopped holding back. Like most killers, the need to escalate his actions became more and more pronounced as time passed. His usual vices no longer being enough to satisfy his mind, he went from killing small animals to killing slightly larger animals. It wasn't difficult, and it wasn't hard to get away with it. Then he eventually upgraded to humans, whenever even that couldn't quite scratch the itch. He went on a killing spree that completely shocked the world, starting small, but ending up not quite as small. Some would even say that he went global, traveling all around the world and killing a lot of politicians. He always aimed high, not satisfied with just killing prostitutes or regular people. Although he did kill plenty of those as well. No, he wanted to kill people that could make a difference in the world. For a few years, he was believed to be the deadliest assassin in the world, known in the underworld simply as Joseph. He never bothered hiding his identity, as he had never bothered living a normal life after he flew off the handle. He spent most of his time in the lawless zones of the world, traveling undercover and even getting cosmetic surgery a few times. Although he was simply called Joseph, people had another name for him. His epithet that he earned after killing so many people and escaping so many times: the Faceless Ghost. He worked with such efficiency that he only needed weeks to do something that would otherwise take months for an entire assassin organization. But that was because he never cared about cleanup. He didn't care about witnesses. He simply took his shot or slit a throat and left. No one could stop him, and Joseph was racking up bounty after bounty with little to no regard for his own safety. He was a rabid dog, biting at everything that he could and ripping apart as many people as possible. But in the end, his recklessness caught up to him. He decided to take a mission with a few people he had worked with in the past, others that could roll like him. But he had made too many enemies with his reputation and his lack of secrecy. Turns out, there was an even larger bounty on his head than the reward of the mission they were doing. Joseph was a bit shocked at first, but he never really cared much about his own safety. Even when changing his face, he only did it for convenience, to keep his spree going for longer. Even when he was caught by the police as he was bleeding out in an alleyway, with knives sticking out of him in numerous places, and with the corpses of his teammates surrounding him, he didn't care. In the end, he was linked to some of his crimes. It was impossible to link him to all of them, but even the ones that were linked to him were enough to make the case blow up worldwide. As one might have guessed, the fact that Joseph was relatively handsome made him gain quite a following, as many serial killers did. But Joseph didn't really care for the fan letters he received. He simply felt tired, and a bit weirded out by a few of the letters he received. Seriously, some of the people writing me should probably also be in a cell. He hardly understood why the guards even gave him those letters. Still, he wasn't exactly dissatisfied with his capture even when being led to his execution. Joseph was also given a last meal. He only asked for a Big Mac and some fries. A regular meal for a regular day. After all, life wasn't something so precious. that he'd make a big fuss about losing his. After taking so many lives, he had finally had his fill. He felt content. He had seen the worst and the best of humanity. For someone like him, there was no better ending. He had always known that his crimes would catch up to him, but sitting in the electric chair, while surrounded on all sides by armed security, certainly wasn't what he had envisioned. Even while restrained, Joseph was still considered extremely dangerous, as he had ripped out a policeman's throat with his teeth while he was under custody and cuffed. So extra precautions were taken. To the policemen in the room, it was a stressful process. They all detested the man sitting on the electric chair, and they just hoped he'd die faster. To Joseph, though, it was just strange, staring death in the face while feeling so many cold gazes on him. In a sense, he felt a sense of regret as the policemen were preparing for his execution. Have I really lived this life? Did I truly throw away everything in order to give in to my desires? What could I have become in this life had I stuck to a stronger set of morals? Joseph looked at the light bulb hanging over his head with a strange smile. What's the use in thinking about that now? Someone like me simply was never meant for this world. He looked back at the ground as he heard the policemen finish their preparations. And with that, without any more courtesy, and without any other formality, the policeman in charge simply pulled the lever. Joseph looked at the one-way window that spectators were supposed to be behind. He was able to see his reflection without any issue, only slightly obstructed by his overgrown black hair. The next thing Joseph felt was pain. He felt as if he was being burnt alive, but he couldn't move. Out of reflex, he struggled against the restraints placed on him. He managed to break the restraints from one of his wrists after putting enough effort into it, but it was already too late. Joseph could feel his heart stop as the officers around him also prepared a firing line, just in case. He simply looked at the ground for a bit, blood dripping out of his mouth and eyes. It was a painful few seconds for Joseph, but it wasn't anything he wasn't used to already. And with that, Joseph Knox was pronounced dead, executed by electric chair. Joseph didn't know what to expect when he opened his eyes again. The fact that he could open or feel them was about what he expected though. In the first place, he didn't think that opening his eyes would even be a possibility. Why was he even conscious? Executions were usually the permanent type of change in life. At least that was what Joseph thought. But this was also somewhat within his expectations, as he tried once more to open his eyes only to not see anything at all. It wasn't difficult to realize that he had no eyes to open. In complete darkness, he could only make out sounds around him. It felt odd, but he could hear talking. Humans around him were talking. They seemed to be speaking as that Japanese. Joseph was able to recognize it rather easily. He was proficient in many languages, as his adventure had him strung around the world repeatedly. He wasn't prone to spending a long time on his missions, but he had multiple missions in some countries, and Japan happened to be one of them. Now, Joseph wasn't exactly fluent in that language, but he could still understand what was being said to some extent. We can't, twins. We have to, adoption. Joseph could hear a male voice speaking out with a rather cold tone. The woman wasn't any warmer in her way of speaking. Yes, this child blind can't raise. Joseph, at this point, was able to put the pieces together. Wherever he was now a child. He couldn't speak, only releasing small cries when attempting. And he also couldn't see, most likely born with a birth defect of some kind. It was also rather easy to tell from what he could pick up in the conversation of his parents that he wasn't about to be accepted in a loving family. How or why he was now an infant hardly mattered. Still, Joseph didn't know what to make of the situation at all. He was simply flabbergasted as he waded around and tried to gain his bearings. The world around him wasn't waiting though, as he was eventually carried away and given into adoption on a mountain. Joseph was rather frustrated at that point. Being helpless wasn't something that he was excited about, especially the situation he found himself in now, not being able to do anything other than scream and cry as he felt the cold around him slowly erode his small body. It wasn't hard to guess that he was somewhere on a snowy mountain, the worst type of mountain to abandon a baby on. Joseph almost found it amusing, as his second life was about to end just as quickly as it began. It didn't even feel to him like a full hour had passed between him coming to consciousness and being thrown in the wild. He didn't quite know what to do at this point, so he only resigned himself to his fate, believing that he wasn't deserving of anything more. That was when he heard it. It was faint in the distance. He could hear it. Footsteps, the sound of marching men, most likely soldiers by their rhythmic and determined strides. There was also the smell of blood, one that he was very familiar with. Joseph could feel the vibrations of their footsteps. He couldn't quite locate them though, so he decided to do the only thing he could do at the moment. He started screaming and crying as loud as his little lungs could allow him to. In truth, Joseph didn't expect much to happen. If anything, he hoped the men would just put him out of his misery. After all, if not even his parents wanted to be burdened with him, a group of soldiers would certainly not want him there. But that wasn't exactly quite what happened. The group of runaway samurai was scared to shit when they heard a child crying in the distance. They were simply looking for shelter, having just done something irreversible. They were deserters. not samurai and brave warriors like their forefathers had been. They had shamed their lineage, thrown mud on their family names, all of that for refusing to die. They had just fled from a battle. Running away was completely against their code, and they knew that returning home would only get them executed. So they planned to simply become mountain nomads. Still, deserters or not, they were samurai at heart. They weren't the type of men that could simply ignore a child's cry. They approached the sounds with caution, as they were afraid of it being a shinobi trick that they had heard so much about. Shinobi didn't interfere with the land of iron, but there were exceptions, and the group of runaway Ronin weren't going to start testing faith. Eventually, they reached the source of that sound. Looking down, the 10 of them could see it. A small child crying on the snowy ground. The child was not even wearing a blanket, it was simply unceremoniously thrown out there. The deserters didn't know what to even say when seeing that. One of them quickly acted, picking up the child and using his vest to cover it. To them, the life of such a young child was sacred. Many of them had families that they needed to protect at home, and they would likely never be able to return to those families. But the notion of killing a child in such a brutal way simply made them gag. It wasn't uncommon in their culture for a family to abort unwanted children in this way though. Still, they weren't pleased with what they saw. To see such a sacred thing tarnished made all of the people present angry, especially when seeing that the child's limbs were frostbitten. They had quite literally gotten there in the nick of time. Were they even 4 or 5 minutes late, the child would have definitely died. All of the men acted quickly. They knew they didn't have the time to build any type of shelter, so they rushed toward a small cave and built a fire somewhat close to the entrance. They quickly started clothing the child with whatever they could as they holed up from the cold night in that small cave. The former samurai had no idea what to do though. They couldn't simply leave the child in the mountains, as they weren't willing to let an infant die. But they also couldn't return to a city and give him for adoption properly, as they were wanted men by now, and they'd be hunted down everywhere they went. In the end, the group of men decided to just keep the child. They knew that it was going to be rough. They knew that this decision could cause a lot of trouble, but they knew that, at the end of the day, they were making the right choice. Simply hearing the child's satisfied laughter filled them with more warmth than the campfire they had just made. And so, their minds were set. They were going to raise that child to become a great man. And for Joseph, this was the first time in his life he had ever received help from others. And he was not the ungrateful type. He wasn't going to throw away the chance to live that he had just received. Maybe this life, I can turn it around. Maybe I don't have to spend my whole life running away. With that thought, he let his small body rest as the former samurai around him did their best to maintain the fire and keep him warm. So, his new life in the mountains started. POV Joseph. This is kinda the usual staple for my fanfics. POVs will change from time to time. The years flew by as I grew up. It didn't take me long to realize that I am not exactly in a modern time. The people that saved me are all samurai, deserters to be exact. At first, I wasn't sure where I'm exactly, but after listening to some conversations, I heard names like Shinobi and Cage being dropped. It reminded me of a Japanese cartoon I used to watch when I was in the orphanage, about a kid that dreamed of becoming the Hokage. At first, I thought it was absurd, but that would explain the energy I can feel in my body and around me. I don't know how, but I was reborn in this world. I don't know where exactly, but it's certainly not in any major city. Shinobi are also not common around these parts. From what I was able to pick up, this country's military only consists of samurai. I am now thankfully able to speak Japanese perfectly. I picked up whatever words I didn't know during the years. My benefactors also did their best to teach me how to talk. It was rather clumsy, but they tried nonetheless, and it did help me in the end. In the end, I even received a name. They decided to call me Kyoshi-ken, which would literally translate to Silent Blade. I think I'll go with that name from now on, purely out of respect for my saviors. They took inspiration from the fact that I didn't really cry at all as a child, not even when starving for several days. That instance was rather common, although my benefactors did their best. It wasn't all that easy for them. I don't blame them at all though. They were the ones that gave me a second chance at life. I don't know where I would have ended up if I died again. Maybe I would have just gone to hell as I deserve. These men, although not innocent angels, gave their best to protect me and preserve my life. Maybe they are, in some way, trying to repent for their sins through me as well. Regardless, the 10 deserting samurai that adopted me all went through so many hardships. 4 of them passed away in these 5 grueling years. The first one to pass away, and someone that I learned the name of later, was Nakada Isamu. He passed away because he wrapped me in his winter clothing. A cold of all things got to him. Whatever medicine they had, they used it all on me. The warmth of the fire wasn't enough to cure his ailment. They couldn't afford to go to a settlement as they'd get hunted down and killed. In the end, Isamu told them to shut the fuck up and let him die. From what the others said, the man went out with a smile. The other three were brothers. They only went by Rai, Jiro and Ken. They passed away in quick succession as a group of samurai had managed to find a hideout. Since my saviors were deserters, they were simply treated as criminals. The three brothers were the ones to hold back the samurai while the rest of us fled. Well, I was still a baby, so I was carried. The fact that they had to die made me rather angry, but there was simply nothing I could do as a baby now. I've grown quite a bit. I am around 1 meter, 3.2 feet in height, and I have been doing my best to train my body ever since I could walk around. Well, as much as one can train as a baby, which is not much, but I at least gained some coordination faster as I got used to my body. As described by Daisuke, the leader of the deserter group that took me in, my appearance is extremely strange. Jarring even, some people would be terrified if they aren't prepared to see it. I have long spiky black hair. That's not the scary part, THOUGH obviously. Thing is, it's not that I'm blind. I am actually missing the upper half of my face completely. Anything above my mouth is gone, only appearing as swirls of flesh. Apparently, at least my nostrils are intact. One of the samurai that had some knowledge in medicine did try to see if my eyes were covered by patches of skin. A birth defect that was possible, and they thought/hoped that they'd be able to help me if that was the case. But he only ended up discovering that my skull doesn't even have eye sockets at all, which makes me feel a bit strange. How much radiation was my mother in this world exposed to for me to end up like this? Well, it was enough to fry her brain and destroy any sense of morals she might have had. I didn't let that discourage me though. Even without eyesight, my other senses seemed to be able to make up for that. Smell, hearing, even feeling vibrations through the earth. Although I can't see, and I won't ever be able to see, I am able to use my enhanced senses to make up for that. It took actual years of training and acclimating, but now I am able to feel whenever people are nearby. It's odd, but it's likely due to this strange energy inside me. I thought it was chakra, as that was what I remembered being used in the show, but it wasn't as simple as that. Koji, the doctor, was able to confirm that my chakra networks are different than usual, but he wasn't able to tell me much more than that. Apparently, we'd need a diagnosis from a much more skilled medic to be able to tell what is actually going on with my body. But even without that, I can sense what is inside my body. After feeling around a bit more, there seem to be two different energies always present in my body. I assume one of them is chakra, but what is the other one supposed to be? I never paid much attention to important things when I watched that show. I was just a small kid, and I only watched a bit, barely even remembering the names of the main characters. That doesn't matter anymore though. I can pretty much ignore that show. For now, I can focus on survival first, and worry about everything else later. Now, I have reached an adequate enough age to actually start training my body. There is still some baby fat on me, but I can start somewhat developing some strength. Currently, we are just sitting in a wooden hut built in the middle of the thick forest. Daisuke and Koji are the only two people present for now. The others are out hunting. It won't be easy to convince either of them to train me, but I do need to try to persuade them. Daisuke, I could sense the leader turn his head towards me in surprise. I guess I don't talk a lot. "What's wrong, Ken?" he asked as he patted the snow off his lap. He just came from outside, was still in a land that seems to have an everlasting winter. "I want to become strong." I tried my best to sound as serious as possible, but that is extremely hard to do with a child's voice. I can't really sense Daisuke's expression, but I guess it would be looking a bit confused right now. I don't know if that's a good idea. Where did this come from anyway?" he asked. The confusion in his tone is rather evident. I can also feel the change in his heartbeat, indicating that he is panicking a bit. I guess it makes sense. I am still blind, and they probably don't want me fighting in the future. Teaching me how to fight would be like putting me in danger to them, at least at first sight. "Daisuke, one day I will grow up. And in this world, for people like us, living peacefully isn't a choice. I need your help, please," I said, bowing my head in his general direction. I've never been against doing things like this. Pride has never meant anything to me anyway. I am also a child now. There is no shame in bowing to someone that took it upon himself to raise me after I was abandoned and left for dead. I could hear Daisuke's breathing become a bit slower. I guess he needs a few seconds to think about it. It might be a bit strange to hear this type of talk from a 5-year-old, but they haven't exactly raised me to think like a regular child. They raised me teaching me that the world isn't a kind place, preparing me for the worst. I guess he just didn't think I'd ask to be trained so soon. To be fair, they did try at first to raise me like a regular child, but the deaths of Rai, Jiro and Ken made them realize that innocence would only get me killed in the future, especially with my constitution. Still, I get why he's hesitating so much. Not being raised as a naive child and learning to fight are two different things. "Very well," Daisuke ended up saying, gaining an odd look from Koji. "Can't exactly tell, but I could feel Koji turning his head towards him, so I'm just assuming here, we start tomorrow. I will teach you to the best of my ability. I could feel him nodding his head to Koji just like that. I now have a sparring partner. POV narration. Daisuke didn't quite know what to make of the child they had been raising. For all the 5 years the child had been alive, Daisuke had never seen him actually cry, besides the time they had found him in the snow. So many months passed by with them doing their best to look after the child. It was strange how easily they got attached to him, but it also made sense. Kiyoshi Ken, the small child, was part of their group. He became one the second they decided to pick him up. Currently, they had nothing left in the world, no one left besides each other. That child, much like them, had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Without them, the child would have been nothing more than another slowly decomposing corpse in the winter wilderness. Daisuke had spent many nights pondering what would have happened had they not saved Kiyoshi. Would they even have the motivation to survive for as long as they did? In the beginning, they were all defeated by the prospect that they'd never see their loved ones again. Daisuke was also one such example. If they returned, they would be executed. Their families were most likely disassociating from them in order to avoid punishment, so returning might even put them in danger too. So, all they had now was the bonds they built with each other. Currently, Daisuke stood in the middle of a clearing with a stick teaching a small Kiyoshi a proper stance. Surprisingly, Ken seemed to at least be a bit of a natural when it came to holding a blade, at least to Daisuke. To Ken, he was just getting used to holding a blade again. It wasn't his first time. He was no master, but he wasn't exactly a novice either. He hadn't exactly been sword fighting opponents in his past life, but he was somewhat familiar with executions and had used small blades consistently throughout his career. But he had never had a proper teacher. All of what he knew was found out through trial and error. Now he had Daisuke giving some semblance of balance to a style that would otherwise only shape up to be wild and bloodthirsty. Daisuke was genuinely shocked. Although Ken was weak in body, he seemed to be an extremely fast learner. His lack of sight didn't seem to bother him either, as he slashed away at falling leaves with frightful precision. The only thing that was lacking currently was speed. There was no way for a small child to showcase speed impressive enough to make Daisuke astonished though. Ken's current blade moved at a speed that Daisuke could track with his trained gaze, but it also seemed to whiz a bit in the wind. The more time passed, the faster Ken seemed to get, and the more leaves he seemed to be able to hit with his wooden stick. This training went on for a few months. The other samurai also noticed how determined Ken was, so they all imparted parts of their respective styles to him. There were no such things as secret styles among them. They were all family, and what they had they shared. The sword training then shifted from Ken hitting falling leaves to Ken sparring with Daisuke or whoever was available. The adults were obviously going easy on the blind child, at least at first, but by the time Ken turned 6, they had no choice but to block his strikes in earnest. At this point, it was rather obvious that Ken could see. Everyone could tell that his sight was likely related to chakra, so they also started trying to teach him how to use it in fights. They taught him a few chakra control exercises, which Ken was able to complete perfectly in very minimal time. Constantly controlling and feeling the energies inside of him since birth had gifted him with a huge advantage when it came to controlling said energies. At this point, the samurai realized that they had a prodigy on their hands. They had no idea just how major their child's accomplishments were, as they were merely samurai. But most children at Ken's age could barely sense their chakra. Very few could control it, let alone perfectly. Ken didn't have anywhere to learn jutsu from though. He simply learned the samurai ways. And a samurai's main ability, and the most powerful, was infusing their blades with chakra. After realizing that the small child could already almost perfectly control chakra, Daisuke was quick to try and teach Ken how to perform chakra flow. They didn't have any way of finding out what type of chakra Ken had, but they would as soon as Ken managed to perform it properly. Chakra flow usually required one to know such things, but they simply had no way of gaining those types of training supplied out in the mountains. And regardless, they bet on the fact that Ken was a prodigy, that the small child would manage to forge his own path. And the very first day Ken reached the age of 7 years old was the first time he managed to infuse chakra into his blade. His small tanto sparked with lightning, and a blue coat seemed to cover the edge of the blade perfectly. From this, Daisuke was able to tell that Ken had a lightning attribute. That much was obvious. But he also had the wind attribute. That one was a bit less obvious, but a trained eye could tell. Ken was excited when he had finally achieved the state of chakra flow. He quickly rushed to the nearest tree. The tanto in his hand seemed to be completely covered by a blade of chakra. With a single swipe, Ken was able to cut the tree in half instantly. The wood was cut cleanly, to the point where the wood felt smooth to the palm when Ken touched it. It was around that time that Daisuke and the others realized that they didn't have much else to teach Ken. He had learned everything too quickly. 2 years was all that it took for him to come to that point. It made them feel a bit inadequate, but they had never been especially powerful. They were mere soldiers, cannon fodder born to die and be buried in mass. At least Ken had demonstrated that his talent put him above the rest. The samurai were confident that he would be able to handle himself in the future, but there would still be some time before little Ken would develop an interest in the real world. Until then, at least the samurai could rest easy, even if some of them were rather salty about the fact that Ken could already beat them in a spar. POV narration: Ken was sitting in the common room, his katana resting on his legs as he sat cross-legged. The rags he wore were ripped in many places. Now that his body was somewhat bigger, he was also given pieces of red samurai armor, which he put on underneath his tattered rags. Ken slowly got up, deciding on his activities for the day, and also starting to look around their camp for a bit. After walking around the forest, he drew a large map on the ground near the front door of the main building of their hideout, using his senses to draw the tracks and openings that he could feel around him. Daisuke noticed him doing so rather quickly. Ken, what's all of this about? The older samurai was rather confused by Ken's decision to randomly start drawing on the ground. I've mapped the surroundings. I'm just drawing it into the dirt for now, Ken said as he continued dragging the hilt of his katana on the ground, while humming in a low voice. Daisuke stopped a bit, blinking a few times as he tried to question himself. Why the only blind person in the group was suddenly interested in drawing maps? Is there really a need for this? I mean, we are likely just going to move at some point anyway. Daisuke rolled his eyes a bit, still looking at the drawings on the ground with a bit of interest. Are we really going to find a better place than this? I don't think so. I think it's time we settled in one place permanently. Patrols don't come this far into the mountains anyway. Ken spoke without holding much back. They were currently using an abandoned shrine as a base. Its walls needed repairing, and it could use some roofing, but Daisuke had made it their temporal base. Many were rather excited about not sleeping in leaf tents and small cabins for once, so Ken decided to start planning out a way to turn the shrine into a permanent home for their wandering group. I get your point, but Ken, we really can't afford to get caught by them. Even if they don't travel this far out, they might spot a hunter's tracks, which will lead them to us eventually. Daisuke's concerns weren't exactly baseless, as that had happened a few times in the past each time they were forced to flee. There are ways to avoid detection. With a map, we can start planning out routes for our hunters to take. We need to establish proper boundaries, and with some luck, we won't have any invaders anytime soon. Ken continued to scribble on the ground until it became a clear image, one that he couldn't quite see but could feel. Daisuke was rather surprised at the detail in Ken's map. It seemed to take into account every crevice of the mountain range. It was as if Ken had been living there his whole life, but Daisuke knew that such a thing wasn't possible. They had only found the shrine a few weeks back, so all that exploring was done in a rather short time frame. Daisuke looked a bit at the child in front of him, who had now turned his gazeless face towards him in an odd manner. Ken waited a bit for Daisuke's reaction until finally fine. Don't give me those eyes. Ken smiled a bit at that joke, grinning as his sharp teeth glinted in the sunlight. Joking about Ken's situation was something that only Daisuke did, and Ken only found it amusing, as he knew it wasn't in poor taste or ill-intentioned. We'll give this a shot, but we must also have escape routes prepared just in case. Daisuke relented in the end, giving Ken's idea a chance. The first thing the two of them decided to do was to draw out some paths for the hunters to take back to camp. The designated hunters were Juru, Osamu, Fumio and Arata. All of them were trained rather extensively, and knew their way around a forest. Still, sometimes it was simply difficult to hide their tracks due to different circumstances, like being caught up in storms or patrols attacking them. Ken and Daisuke were quick to draw up different territories for hunting, with each hunting territory having at least 2 different retreat paths in case of emergency, where the hunter group split up and led the pursuers through a planned array of traps and pitfalls that they would need to set up beforehand. The hunting group would eventually meet up again, after which they were to circle around the place for a bit, before heading directly to a pre-planned decoy base, which they also needed to build. After that, they were to come to the shrine, the actual home. Ken already had planned to build a few different decoy bases throughout the mountain. This plan was bound to make hunting a bit more laborious, but they were a group of former samurai. They knew how to deal with complicated tasks. All of them needed exact coordinates at all times, so Daisuke planned to give each of them a copy of that map to keep with them. The plan itself would take a lot of construction work and trap laying, but they were thankfully not a lazy bunch. Ken had also already started planning to repair the old shrine into a more livable place. By the time the hunters got back to base that night, Daisuke had already managed to draw the maps for their new hunting routes. But their jobs were far from done. The hunters seemed rather excited at the prospect of having a permanent home, so they quickly got to work designing different traps and sharpening sticks. Ken also went off to build a decoy camp. At this point, he was big/strong enough that the samurai mostly let him do whatever he wanted, and so, their group now had plenty of work to do for the following months. But this time they were building something different. Not a temporary shelter from wind and rain. No, they were finally planning to build an actual home. Something that all of them, even Ken, had been longing for a long time. Their sweat was spilt as the seasons changed. Slowly but surely, the paths they were taking days were filled with traps, all leading to dozens of decoy bases all around the mountain range, and even beyond. It was an intricate web that spanned as long as possible, and the shrine became the heart of it all. All of them gathered there at night after a hard day at work, and shared more and more stories. Ken told them of his trips in the forests, of how the birds sometimes landed on his head as he was meditating on tree branches. Daisuke told them of how he once had to cut up a wolf pack while carrying wood for one of the decoy's strongholds. Juru, the physically strongest of the group, told them of how he was once forced to wrestle a bear in order to protect the meat he had hunted. Isamu and Fumio were mostly together at all times. Most of their stories consisted of dunking on patrols and laughing their asses off while running their pursuers in mazes of traps. Arata had a few stories of getting caught in the nets they had set up. He had always been the less dexterous one among them. Koji, the doctor, unfortunately, didn't have many interesting stories. He mostly kept to himself actually, but he did smile a lot when hearing everyone else speak so openly. It was seemingly enough for him to just listen. He was one of the people that didn't leave the shrine much, only gathering herbs nearby from time to time. He handled making medicine and had rebuilt most of the shrine by himself. He also handled most of the cooking. Everyone cleaned their own shit though. All of them were men, and no one had any fun cleaning another man's garments. Even Ken cleaned his own clothes, as the samurai wanted him to grow up to be responsible. Just like that, with their blood, sweat and tears, they had finally built a home, a place where they could return and rest. Ken was satisfied, finally having a place he could call his own, with people that cared about him, and that he could call family. But the world he was in wasn't a peaceful one. How long would his happiness last, I wonder? The months flew by quickly, with the samurai and Ken all doing their best to survive in their new environment. Although at this point, they were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were the kings of that mountain range. Slowly but surely, they had received a name from patrols within the Land of Iron. They were known as the Mountain Hyenas. The hunting group was well known for leading patrols into traps in the area. They were called the hyenas, due to their propensity to laugh at their pursuers from a distance. A few of the decoys had been raided, but nothing major had happened, and Daisuke was just able to build a few more to replace them. The paths that the hunters took through the mountains also constantly changed. Ken spent some time making more traps for their retreating paths. The authorities were not any closer to finding the shrine as they were when they started hunting them though. The shrine was a lot deeper inside the mountain than the decoys and hunting paths were, so their home was relatively safe. Daisuke had scolded the 4 hunters a few times for their careless attitudes. Getting a reputation was not exactly a good thing for them after all, but it was already done, so there was nothing they could do about it besides be more careful in the future. The hunts became more and more restrained as the attention they received also started dying down. During this time, Koji was also able to slip into one of the cities. Enough time had passed for him to be mostly forgotten. He looked completely different to the posters they had of him anyway. It certainly helped that he had never left the base to hunt. This was mostly Daisuke's plan though, to have at least someone capable of going into a city and sometimes buying supplies/spices. Returning to the shrine was done through the same paths that the hunters took, just for added precaution. And when Ken's 8th birthday came, Koji brought Ken a gift, not one that he had bought, but one that he had made. It was a wooden mask painted white with a red dot in the center of the face. It was reminiscent of what some Anbu from the shinobi villages wore, but this one didn't have any eye holes. He also had managed to acquire the 3 beginning jutsus that most ninja villagers practiced. This was bought off a peddler, and he gave them all to Ken on his birthday. One can guess that Ken was rather pumped with the gifts he received. He especially appreciated the mask as he now could finally cut off the bangs that he had always been using to hide his deformed face. Unfortunately, it seemed that none of the jutsus were all that useful for Ken. He couldn't use transformation or clones, as he found it difficult to envision how other people looked. He could tell some features with his senses, but details such as clothes and even facial expressions were impossible. The substitution jutsu also required one to use an optical illusion, which once again, Ken turned out to be unable to do. It was rather tragic, but Ken just decided he'd stick to his swords for now. In the first place, Koji had to read him the techniques and teach him the hand signs, as Ken had no chance of understanding a book. His written Japanese was nowhere near his spoken one, and he also couldn't feel the words on a printed book. In the end, Ken ended his birthday with a smile on his face. Even if the techniques turned out to be a bust, the effort was certainly there, and Ken knew that the samurai had likely spent a good portion of their savings on him. So he started planning out a gift to give the other samurai, as thanks for all of the hard work they had put into raising him. The gift he thought about was also a meaningful one. Ken planned to quickly start building a small memorial for all of the people in their group that had fallen. He didn't even wait more than a few more days before deciding to gather all of the materials needed to build a small altar. He hid them somewhere near camp and proceeded to go on with his plan. He wanted this to be a surprise to everyone, so he pretended to be sick, pretending to have a sickness that would require some herbs from a bit farther away from the shrine. Kenji had read him some medicine books that he had kept around when he had been little, and Ken's memory was extremely good, so all he had to do was imitate some symptoms from that. The herbs weren't far enough for any patrols to appear, but far enough that it would give him enough time to build the memorial place unobstructed. So, Koji and the hunters formed an expedition. Ken needed a bit more to convince Daisuke to go with them. The leader was obviously a bit suspicious, but he ended up going with the herb gathering team as well. He was happy after finally having the entire shrine to himself, so he quickly started building the memorial place, using the materials he had gathered and hidden beforehand. He spent around an hour, and the construction was mostly done. Ken was rather proud of himself. He hoped it also looked pleasing to the eye, but he couldn't quite judge it himself when it came to aesthetics. Ken was still satisfied with the work he had done, so he simply walked over to the front gate and sat down, waiting for his family to arrive back with the herbs. He simply waited and waited. Another hour passed by, and that was when Ken was starting to think that maybe something bad had happened. But he waved away those thoughts, knowing that it was most likely just that they were having issues finding the herbs. At least that was what he thought at first. The silence didn't last long. Unfortunately, boom, that was when he heard it. A deafening sound. Ken could feel the trembling ground at his feet. Ken could feel the trees shaking, the snowy mountain trembling as a small avalanche was formed. The sound instantly filled him with concern, as his greatest fears were manifesting quickly. Confusion overwhelmed his senses, as he quickly ran inside and grabbed his blade, a regular katana, and ran into the forest at inhuman speeds. The more he ran, the more concerned he grew. His steps became heavier and heavier, as he eventually could feel people moving in the distance. But with people moving, he could also smell it. The extremely familiar stench of blood wafting through the air. The burning smell of a smoldering cadaver was a thing he had been somewhat used to at some point, but he didn't think he'd sense it in his new life. His senses flared as the movement died down by the time he got closer. In a small clearing, surrounded by blown-up trees and cut-down bushes, Ken could clearly feel 6 bodies lying on the ground as the mountain winds flowed over them. They were all missing their heads, but Ken could still tell who they were. He knew them by smell at this point. With steady steps, he reached the clearing and stood right in front of the body pile. The grip of his hand weakened as his blade fell to the ground, and his knees simply buckled as he felt something he hadn't thought he'd ever feel in his life: rage. Pure and unadulterated rage. The former assassin had never felt that emotion before. Now he got to experience it in its full glory. Whoever did this, I will find out. Ken started speaking as he placed his hands on the ground, the blood flowing from the bodies coating his gloves directly. I promise that I'll make sure they join you in hell, Ken said as he clutched the hand of a headless corpse whom he had formerly called Daisuke. Ken didn't know what to think. His mind was filled with thoughts of revenge, but he still took a moment to regain his bearings. He stood there for a few seconds, seemingly staring into the abyss. If he had any eyes, they would most certainly be both empty and bloodshot at the same time. The 6 corpses that stood in front of him, the way they were just unceremoniously thrown after being decapitated, it simply didn't sit right with him. They were his family, the only family he had ever had in both of his lives put together. They were the first friends he had made, the first people that he had actually cared about. His mind was simply having a hard time registering the image his senses were describing for him. At the same time, he felt conflicted. For the longest time, he had placed almost no value on any life, human or otherwise. Yet the people in front of him, he couldn't deny their value to his life. The first 4 samurai that died, Ken hadn't gotten that attached to, but the 6 before him had been there with him through thick, and they had all experienced countless hardships together. All of them had been simply surviving in that cruel world that Ken had ended up in. He had been far more attached to Daisuke and Kiji than the others, but they had all still been his family, and all of them treated him with care. They had been the first ones to ever do so, and now they were gone. Ken knew he now had to cope with that, but at the same time, he didn't know any healthy ways of dealing with loss, as he had never experienced it to such a degree. So, Ken didn't mourn for long though, getting up from the ground, straightening his back and grabbing his blade. Whatever bastard did this is sure to still be nearby. He had heard the explosion just recently. The blood was still fresh, and the bodies were still warm. All signs pointed Ken towards the obvious reality that the killers were near, very near. With a deep breath, the young swordsman managed to find the smell of 7 different people besides his family, and immediately started dashing into the forest, tracking them down as best he could. The mountain-raised child now had the nose of a wolf, and the agility of a cheetah as he leapt from branch to branch with the grace of a leopard, not making a single sound as he got closer and closer to his prey. The smell of blood that was wafting from behind him got further and further as he now could feel the culprits clearly within his senses. Stepping from tree branch to tree branch and eventually landing on the ground, he could now discern some of the features of the men as the air around them fluttered around them. 7 people, all of different heights, all seemed to be carrying strange blades. Ken couldn't tell much else about their appearance, as he couldn't exactly see how they were dressed or discern any facial features. With a leap, he pounced on them like a hungry predator, just as reckless as he always had been in his last life. His blade was already drawn as he stabbed toward the one dragging behind them all. It was the largest man among them, with a blade large enough to match. That seemed to be oddly round in shape. The man in question didn't even turn around his hands, didn't even move as he simply tilted to the side and dodged Ken's stab. Ken was a bit surprised by that. His technique had been flawless, and he didn't think he'd be detected. Still, he didn't let that dissuade him as he quickly turned his blade and slashed at the man. The swordsman in question quickly grabbed at the blade on his back and blocked Ken's sword strike, shocking Ken with his reaction speed and agile movements. Ken immediately used chakra flow, his blade flickering with electricity as he tried to dig into the man's blade. But the second the chakra came in contact with the man's sword, it seemed to be absorbed. At a speed Ken could barely react to, the tall and bulky man kicked toward Ken, aiming right for the young child's stomach. Ken managed to put up his guard, blocking the kick and getting sent flying backwards, smashing into a tree and breaking it, as the air left his lungs quickly. "What the hell is wrong with this brat?" the large man said as all 7 of the swordsmen looked at the young attacker with different expressions. They were none other than the 7 swordsmen of the mist, a group of jonin that had been going around the world in order to make a name for themselves. They had specifically come to the Land of Iron after hearing about a rather elusive bandit group, the Mountain Highness, which had somehow racked up a rather high bounty from the daemon of the Land of Iron. The swordsmen of the mist had decided to take up that bounty, stalking the mountains for a few days, before finally finding a trace of one of the usual routes that the bandits took. It just so happens that 6 people came down the mountain after only a day of waiting, 2 more than what the group was reported to be. But the swordsmen didn't bother much, swiftly killing all 6 of them without much issue. All 7 of them were jonin after all, and they were even stronger than the vast majority of other jonin. So the runaway samurai/mountain bandits didn't even get to react before they died. The strike that sealed the deal had been from Jinpachi Minashi. He was able to use his Shibuki/blast sword, which was quite literally a scroll filled with explosive tags on a handle, to blow up and disorient the samurai, which allowed the others to decapitate them swiftly. They gathered the heads in a sack and started making their way back to the daemon's palace to collect the bounty. That was when a small child attacked them out of nowhere. More specifically, Ken had tried to kill Fuguki Tsukazun, the current wielder of the Samahada, the most monstrous blade of the 7 swordsmen of the mist. Ken's assassination techniques were top-notch. The way he had approached them was truly frightening, as not one of the 7 jonin had noticed him in any way. He had made no sound, and they could feel no chakra or bloodlust from him. It was as if they were attacked by a ghost. The only reason Fuguki managed to survive was the Samahada. The sword had wriggled in panic when sensing Ken's approach, alerting its owner that something was indeed wrong. Had it not been for the sword's sentience, Fuguki would have most likely been stabbed and killed in an instant. Fuguki's brow was filled with sweat as he looked at the small brat that had almost just killed him. A little kid just snuck up on us. JKZ Biwa, the current wielder of the Kubikurimj, decapitating carving knife wielded by Zabuza in the future, said as he grasped at the blade on his back. "Be cautious, he seems rather dangerous." Kushimaru Kuraira, the tall blonde swordsman that wielded the NUIBARI sewing needle, said as he also took out his long, needle-shaped blade in one hand and his wire in the other. "What's all the fuss? It's just some random brat," Jinpachi said as he put his blast sword on his shoulder and started walking toward the kid. "Or did you get lost?" tilde. The second he reached in front of Ken leapt towards him. Ken knew that he wasn't likely to be treated as a child, since he had just ambushed them, so he wasn't planning to wait for them to attack first. Jinpachi smiled sadistically as he swung his blast sword towards the child, not showing any mercy, as his blade released an explosion large enough to shake the earth underneath them. Ken was sent flying by that explosion, breaking a few more trees with his back, as he stabbed his blade into the ground to stop himself. Ken didn't even get the time to breathe as another swordsman was already on him. This time it was none other than JKZM, who had followed Ken at breakneck speeds, and swung his sword towards him. Ken barely got to raise his sword in time to meet the incoming strike, shocking JKZM with his reaction time. Unfortunately, reaction time couldn't make up for the difference in weapon quality and strength. JKZM's blade broke through Ken's small katana rather quickly, slashing the young swordsman across the chest horizontally. The bones in Ken's hands cracked due to his opponent's strength, making the situation even worse. Ken fell backwards, his hand losing its grip on the broken katana as he hit the ground. AKZM couldn't help but laugh out loud when seeing the blood spill from Ken's lips. Ha 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 ha. I can't believe this brat. Did you guys see the way he blocked that? JKZM said as he turned around and looked at his colleagues. That was a huge mistake on his part. Ken slipped the mask off of his face, and Ken quickly jumped onto the man's back, crossing his legs around his torso, and instantly biting at his throat with his sharp teeth. AKZM was shocked, quickly grabbed onto the child's hair with one hand and slipped his fingers onto his lower jaw with the other. His fingers bled as he struggled against the rabid child's teeth. He eventually succeeded in what he had planned, breaking Ken's jaw with his superior strength and kicking Ken into a tree once more. AKZM was no longer in any mood to laugh. He clutched at his throat as he gasped a few times, spitting some blood as he realized that he had actually been injured rather seriously. I told you to be careful. Kushimaru walked over. He would have stabbed Ken through the head had JKZM not been able to break his jaw. Shut up, AKZM said as he still clutched at his bleeding neck. He must have been related to the bandits from earlier, most likely out for revenge. Another one of the swordsmen walked towards the downed Ken. This time, it was Jinin Akabino, the wielder of the Kabuto-ori, which was technically a hammer and an axe tied together. Such a pathetic little thing, Jinpachi said with his blast sword still slung over his shoulder. No need to ridicule him, Kushimaru said, giving his companion a long look before staring back at the downed child. At this point, all of the swordsmen noticed something. Their opponent, the one that had almost killed two of them, and that managed to block so many of their strikes, was completely blind. Not only blind, but completely missing the upper half of his face. It was honestly jarring to look at even for the trained jonin. I think it's better we kill this one here, Kushimaru said as he raised his needle blade and stabbed the child directly in the chest, right through where he knew the heart would be. The other swordsmen also seemed rather weirded out. Ultimately, they all agreed with Kushimaru's decision though, seeing no issue with getting rid of a future powerful enemy out for revenge. Still, their jobs were done, so they went back and collected the sack filled with the heads of the mountain bandits, and continued going down the mountain. Ken didn't have any bounty on his head, so they didn't bother with him anymore, simply leaving the corpse behind. The 7 swordsmen were left a bit humbled by the experience, especially the 2 that had almost lost their lives in the fight against a blind mountain child. As they were leaving, Ken's fingers twitched a bit. Not one of them had noticed it though. After all, who would think such a thing was possible, right? Ken didn't know what to feel when he recovered his senses. He could smell plenty of his own blood in the air. He could feel the swordsmen departing, but he didn't have the strength to stop them. They didn't turn around either, only kept going until they were completely out of his range. That was the only moment Ken was actually able to calm down momentarily and focus on his own body. He could feel both of his energies. One of them was his chakra, weakened as some of it had been absorbed by the blade of one of the swordsmen. The other energy was now the dominant one, at least briefly. It was revolving around his entire body in a way Ken had never felt before. Ken had never actually managed to control it himself, but it seemed to naturally strengthen his body at all times for some reason. Ken could feel his body mending. Slowly, he would surely be immobile for a few hours at the very least. The energy was running rampant in his body by itself. He could feel it clearly. The more it dissipated while healing his wounds, the more of it seemed to be automatically absorbed from his surroundings. Yet, it seemed to automatically balance itself to match his chakra, which now would have technically slowed down his healing, if it was not constantly being absorbed from the air around him as he powered through the pain and breathed as much and as deeply as he could. Ken had no clue what that energy was. It seemed to be related to nature from how it was being absorbed from around him, but Ken still had no clue as to what it was. Although, it was pretty clear that it had saved his life. Another thing that had clearly saved his life was the fact that, unlike most people, his heart was actually located slightly more to the right, a bit covered by one of his lungs. It was likely related to his birth, as he was pretty hideously deformed at the end of the day. Kushimaru had only slightly grazed his heart instead of piercing it. Had it been pierced, Ken would have likely died regardless of that energy. Who knew that a human can actually get that strong? Ken pondered on the people that had almost killed him, while simply enjoying the wind beating on his broken body. Ken had thought himself relatively powerful. The strange nature-related energy had made him stronger than most adults, despite only being 8 years old. He didn't remember or know much about the world he found himself in, but he had felt that cutting down 1 or 2 trees with a sword swing was already powerful. It seemed that he wasn't all that great after all. At least not yet. He had the technique forged in the blood of tens of thousands from back in his world. He had the surprise attack on them, and yet he had still ended up in his current state. From the beginning to the end, Ken had trouble following the movements of his opponents. He could initially tell that they were stronger than him from their strides and the way they carried themselves, but he thought he would be able to make up for the difference with skill. It seemed that the 7 adults were also plenty skilled. This isn't acceptable. Ken felt clenched one of his broken arms with a frown on his face. He simply felt inadequate. The ones that killed his family were simply able to walk away despite his best efforts. That was when it hit him. No, in the first place. I've just turned 8 this week. These people seem to be talented people that have trained their entire lives. That train of thought managed to raise a different emotion in Ken. A wide, crazed and toothy smile rose on his lips, his sharpened teeth somewhat red from the blood that he had just spit out. 7 swordsmen all carrying special swords. Not exactly a low-key group. Next time we meet, all of them will die. No, I won't just kill them. I'll make sure to get strong enough to crush them. Ken's wide smile didn't disappear at all. Not even when wolves had gathered around him, cautiously circling around him, as if they were waiting for him to die or pass out. They had likely smelled all of the blood in the area. While they were approaching, Ken was in his own mind, thinking of the ways he would go about killing the swordsman. With those thoughts in mind, he simply let out a small laugh. All the wolves reared back when hearing it. Then the small laugh turned louder and louder, becoming more and more demented by the second. Ken's aura fled up. He released a wave of killing intent so baleful and vile that all of the wolves seemed to freeze up instantly when it passed over them. Ken's laughter resonated throughout the clearing he was in. The wolves instantly turned tail and ran away, not wanting to get any closer to the thing laying on the ground. After all, no matter how winded it was, a predator would always be dangerous prey to hunt. Ken didn't really bother with the wolves. He merely sat there for the next few hours, running simulations in his mind about how that fight could have gone had he been just a little bit stronger. Eventually, though, his bloodlust had calmed down as he regained his bearings and painfully sat back up. The bones in his arms were still cracked all over, but they were slowly mending. It seemed that most of his flesh wounds were already healed up. With his hands hanging limply by his sides, he started walking back towards the place where his family was killed, and by extension towards his only home. He stopped by the corpses of his family. He wasn't the type to put an emotional value on corpses, but he still valued their memory greatly. So he used his broken arms to grab onto something important from each of them. He dragged his broken body back to the temple, his home, which was now empty. Ken could feel the air flowing through it, as he realized just how little the house meant without the people living in it. The previously warm enclosure and safe space they had built was now nothing more than a cold and desolate scenery. The fire that was usually kept alight by Koji had also gone out while Ken was out. Ken at this point realized that he wouldn't be able to live there for long. It was no longer a home. It was just a residence now, and it was also a graveyard. Ken approached the shrine he had built, the little memorial place he had made for the people that fell before them. Now, 6 more trinkets were placed on it. Daisuke's hairpin. The man had always had long hair, and his hairpin always held it in place even during training. Koji's favorite kunai, which he also used as a scalpel. It wasn't exactly a sentimental item, but Koji was not the type of person to keep trinkets and to give meaning to items. Juru's necklace, which was made out of wolf fangs from wolves that he had hunted as a young man. Isamu had his favorite pair of sandals, one that Ken had actually made for him. The samurai had cherished it quite a bit. Fumio had a small tanto, the first blade that Ken had used as a small child. It was a family relic of sorts, and Fumio had given it to Ken for a while to train with a sharp blade. And Arata's cracked glasses, as the less dexterous member, he unfortunately also had some eyesight problems, but that never deterred him. Ken stood there for a bit, carving away at a few pieces of wood with his less broken arm as he made the shrine a bit larger. After spending a bit of time on that, Ken dropped his tools, which were just sharpened stones, and went on inside the temple, falling asleep on his futon almost instantly as tiredness took over his body and mind. The last thing he thought about brought an honest smile to his lips as he remembered the recent celebration of his birthday. A warm moment, one that he would no longer have the luxury to experience. And with that, Ken blacked out. EOV narration: the 7 swordsmen of the mist managed to collect the bounty successfully, but not one of them had forgotten the strange child that had attacked them, especially not the 2 that had almost died to him. Fuguki walked forward in a robotic manner, trying to play out a scenario in his mind where he would have survived that encounter. But had it not been for his good luck, as well as having Samahada, he would have died there instantly. He, a genin, and a powerful member of the 7 swordsmen of the mist would have died to a child had his luck been any worse. Why was he able to hide his presence so perfectly? It was as if he was blended with his surroundings. I couldn't even feel him when he was in front of me. Fuguki's back was filled with sweat as he remembered the cold feeling he got when that sword came for his head. No sound was made, and no killing intent was leaked for even a second. Those were not the movements of a child. Those were the movements of a highly trained assassin. Not a single academy child would be able to come close to that kind of skill. While Fuguki was thinking about stealth skills and assassination techniques, JKZM Biwa was thinking about something else entirely. JKZM was a person known for his brutality. He had played with his opponents mercilessly before. He took the slightest bit of pleasure in seeing his opponent squirm. He simply couldn't understand it. How could a child be even more brutal than him? Usually, he was playful with his victims, his brutality only extending as far as his actions did, as he preferred to mock his victims. He wasn't against biting an opponent's neck in order to win, but the way it was done this time was simply creepy. He could tell that the child was far from disgusted when biting into his flesh. Rather, the opposite, he still remembered the corners of the child's lips pointing upwards. The muffled giggle as he crunched down tighter on JKZM's neck. JKZM could only rub his bandaged neck as he remembered that moment with cold sweat on his spine. It was as if he had been attacked by a rabid animal. He hadn't even heard a grunt of pain or a shout of any sort even when almost ripping off the child's jaw. He refused to believe that a child of all things would be so feral. So he no longer thought of the child as a human being. Good thing it's dead now. None of the swordsmen felt the need to look further into the matter, only sending in the heads and receiving the reward for the bandits. They also told the daimyo the location of the parts that the bandits were taking. Someone had to clean up the mountains after all. And a squad was sent eventually. A few days later, a squad of 10 samurai was sent to clean up the mountain of traps and corpses, as they knew that the jonin certainly didn't bother to clean up after themselves. The squad was also led by a high-ranking samurai, a hatamoto, a banner carrier or a guardian of the banner, direct guards of the daimyo and considered vassals that owned mansions of their own. Technically, each hatamoto was just as powerful as a jonin, but they were not experienced in any form of assassination personally. Some could recognize them and protect themselves from them, but none could perform them as they were considered cowardly tricks. This hatamoto in particular was told to go there personally in order to scout out the situation and find the original hideout of the bandits. The other men with him were nothing more than gate guards, only there to handle the cleanup, as a hatamoto was not to get his hands dirty cleaning up corpses. The hatamoto eventually managed to find a thin trail of blood. He followed the trail in one direction and managed to find a pool of blood in a clearing with cut and exploded trees. A fight definitely happened here, but this was not in the report those jonin provided. Just goes to show that you can never trust shinobi. The hatamoto looked at the pool of dried blood on the ground with a skeptical gaze. No one would survive losing that much blood. Someone else might have dragged the body away. He quickly came to that conclusion and decided to trace the blood in the other direction. He told the gate guards and his squad to keep cleaning up the scene before following him. He was confident in dealing with one bandit, and if there were more he could always simply escape and inform his lord. Thankfully, the trail of blood had also not been covered up by snow, as there hadn't been any storms on that mountain recently. He followed the trail of blood all the way to the side of what appeared to be a patched up abandoned temple. This must have been the actual main base of the mountain hyenas. He drew his blade silently as he walked into the compound slowly. He could see the patched up walls. The building was maintained, but the fire in the yard seemed to have gone out. It's possible that they have moved out, but I need to be cautious. The hatamoto grasped his blade with a serious gaze as he looked at the main building of the temple. He also noticed what seemed to be a small shrine near it. He was able to notice that it hadn't been built all that long ago, and some of the items on there were bloody. This is certainly recent. 10 memorial items, 10 missing deserters. It's been 8 years. But I guess Daisuke didn't make it in the end. The hatamoto remembered Daisuke and his squad. He had been the one to give them the initial order that caused them to become deserters. Their orders had been rather simple. Daisuke himself was a Gokunin at some point, 2 ranks below a hatamoto, but still a vassal with his own land. So he was the squad leader. They were tasked to send a message to the 5 kage of each shinobi village to force them to end the war. It was basically a suicide mission. They likely wouldn't even make it past the first cage before being killed. That was why Daisuke decided to save the lives of his squad and become nomads. The hatamoto looked at the small shrine with a scowl. I still remember getting scolded by our lord for his betrayal. He would have slashed the shrine in half from hatred, but dishonoring the dead was in poor taste, so he simply moved on. The hatamoto couldn't sense anyone inside the building, but he knew that there was a possibility for the one that had built the small shrine to still be inside. So, instead of entering the temple, he simply imbued his katana with his chakra, making it glow in a deep blue light. It was a legendary blade gifted to him by his lord for his extensive service. It was made out of chakra-conductive metals, and sharper than any regular blade, said to even be on par with legendary blades, such as the sword of Tetsuya. Otsuka. It was officially called the Severing Sword. With an upward motion, he sent a flying slash towards the temple, splitting it in half rather easily. He then swiped his sword a few more times, cutting the temple more and more until it collapsed completely. He then sheathed his blade and looked at the rubble with expectation in his gaze, preparing for a quick draw technique as soon as any assailant showed himself. He stood in that position for a few minutes. Then he noticed that there was simply no movement in the temple ruins. He narrowed his eyes as he proceeded to turn around. The Hatamoto walked a few steps, before drawing his blade and slashing behind him at speeds that could barely be followed with the naked eye. Quite a bit of sweat was present on his brow as he looked around. A foreboding feeling simply made him shiver. Something isn't right. He felt as if he was intruding into a lion's den. As if a predator had its gaze locked on him, he was being hunted. That was pure instinct that he had forged through countless battles. In comparison, the 7 swordsmen of the mist were still beginners to him, who had been a Hatamoto for a few decades. His instincts were more honed even if he was weaker in strength. Show yourself. The fact that his voice trembled a bit only made things worse, and he knew that showing your fear to a predator was a sure way to die. Unfortunately for him, he was not a sensory type. Even if he was, the odds of him sensing Ken were extremely low unless he was on the level of an actual cage. From behind him, he could suddenly hear movement. He turned around quickly only to see dozens of Senbo and shuriken coming his way. His mind panicked slightly as his fear materialized, but his body moved as if on instinct. His blade swiped at impressive speeds, protecting his body perfectly from the projectiles in front of him. As he was blocking the projectiles, Thogger, he felt something strange, as if something cold had slipped into him. Looking down, he could see 2 blades sticking out of his body, one from his stomach and one from his chest. He had already bled quite a lot, so he didn't even know when it had happened exactly. What? He looked forward where the projectiles had been coming from, only to see a poorly set up spring trap at the entry of the temple. No. He tried to turn around to slash his blade behind him, but by now his body had already lost a lot of blood. His slower than usual slash was dogged perfectly, as the blade seemed to slip out of him without any issue. In front of him was a short masked figure, nothing more than a child wearing ill-fitting red armor and tattered black rags around his shoulders. A white mask with a large red dot in the center with no visible eye holes. That figure seemed to be staring into his soul. The Hatamoto immediately collapsed to the ground as he felt the strength leave his body by the second. His blade was also dropped at that point. Ken simply picked it up, looking at it with interest, flowing his chakra through it while completely ignoring the dying man at his feet. A great blade, I'll be taking this. The Hatamoto felt more and more horror when hearing the nonchalant and young voice that escaped that mask. I don't appreciate you destroying my house, but I guess it's no longer home when I'm alone, he said as he walked over to the Hatamoto, who was currently trying to crawl away. I must warn the others. They need to flee and inform the Lord. The man was concentrated on his duty. He felt it was odd that he unintentionally rolled around on the ground. At least that was what he thought had happened up until he saw his body. A few meters away, only his head had rolled off. He could see in his last moments Ken scavenging the scabbard from his corpse. Ken then looked at the path that led down the mountain, as he knew there must have been more people there. I feel the need to blow off some steam now. These are the same people that forced us into the mountains in the first place anyway. Ken then looked at the corpse of the man he had just killed. His opponent had been strong, even able to cut down the large temple with ease. Still, in Ken's eyes, he seemed weaker than the swordsman that had almost killed him. At least, he had less awareness when it came to assassination techniques. Maybe he was a great fighter, but Ken wasn't out to fight him. He simply wanted to kill him, and that was much easier. After all, he was an assassin by profession, even if he was dressed as a samurai. They must be here to clean up after the swordsman from earlier. He then continued down the mountain to clean up the rodents that had infested his former home. Ken walked down the mountain as he ran his hand on his newly acquired blade. It was an extremely sharp sword. Ken touched the razor edge carefully, his senses heightened to an extreme. The katana didn't seem to have a cross guard, so the sword handle connected seamlessly with the sheath. It was a simple blade, not ornate, for it was an object of murder, not a centerpiece over a fireplace. But more importantly, it was a much better blade than what he had previously. With this, I can at least compete with those swordsmen in one department. He still remembered the way his blade had snapped in that fight, the way he was betrayed by his weapon. His body would have kept going even with broken arms, but the blade falling apart had put him at a huge disadvantage, and it led to him receiving a slash across the chest. Even now, Ken could feel the marks of his healed wounds on his body. It seemed that the energy in his body merely enhanced his body's natural regeneration, not magically healed him. The scars would remain, and Ken didn't mind that. He'd keep them as reminders. The blade itself was long, longer than Ken was currently in fact, but it was also surprisingly light. Ken knew that the length could be problematic, as it was a bit awkward to take it out of its sheath in case of an emergency, but he'd get used to it eventually. The fact that the blade was light might have also had to do with the fact that Ken was physically stronger than most adults. Well, the majority of adults and certainly all adults from Earth. The examples Ken had been running into lately had made him rather discouraged. If he had tried to fight that Hatamoto face to face, he would have surely died, and that wasn't exactly acceptable. Ken had planned to question him to find out more about the people that had almost killed him, but seeing him cut down the temple with a few sword swipes made him realize that killing him was the safer option. After all, it was highly unlikely that they had only sent one person for the mission, when it likely included the cleanup of all of the traps they had laid out in the mountain range. The chances of these people being stronger than the man he had just killed were also relatively low, so Ken wasn't exactly worried, although he was still vigilant, refusing to be as reckless as he had been with attacking the 7 swordsmen. After all, if he had stalked them for a while and hadn't just rushed in, he would have managed to kill a few of them at least. It was a shame, but at least he was alive now, and he had plenty of time to try again. With a sigh, Ken strapped the large sword to his back, not having any better way of transportation yet. He kept the 2 smaller katanas that his family had been using at his waist, as he also took some supplies like food and water from the collapsed temple. He also filled his backpack and pockets with as many senbos and shuriken as he could. They didn't have all that many to begin with, so he ended up collecting the ones he had used for the improvised spring trap that he had used to assassinate the Hatamoto. And so, with large strides, Ken started dashing down the mountain range, knowing where he'd be able to find more people, the clearing that still held the corpses of his family. By the time Ken got there, the soldiers had already lit up a fire underneath the mound of headless dead bodies. After all, criminals deserved no burial to them. Ken didn't react much to that either. Instead, he quietly waltzed around the clearing from tree branch to tree branch, each step he took masked by the wind, as he studied the situation. 9 men, all of them wearing light armor and thick fur coats. Their attire was a lot less formal than the man he had killed. Ken judged that they weren't all that strong rather quickly. Not one of them seemed to have anything special about them. The amount of chakra they had even paled in comparison to his, let alone the Jonin-level fighters he had been facing recently. Ken knew a bit about shinobi rankings. Daisuke had made sure to educate him on plenty of things related to the world. At least he now had some assurance that he wasn't all that weak, and had just been competing with tough opponents up to that point. Without feeling the need to extend the situation and wait for assassination opportunities, Ken simply stood up straight on top of the tree he was on. None of the samurai had noticed him yet. Ken felt his weapons for a bit, wondering what he should use in the fight for a few seconds, before deciding to use his newest blade. Now, taking it out of the sheath was currently physically impossible for him, due to the length of the blade. So Ken simply took it off his back and unsheathed the sword slightly, after which he simply pointed it to the ground, letting the sheath slide off and land on the ground with a small thud. This had finally alarmed the 9 warriors below, as they all looked at the source of the sounds and drew their blades. "Who's there?" one of them asked as he kept a perfect stance despite his panicking mind. Eventually, one of the men looked up, his eyes widening, as he saw the blood-smeared figure of small stature. A blood-red samurai armor and a tattered cloak stained with blood all over. In his hands was a long blade, held in an odd stance as it was pointed at the ground slightly to the side. The strangest part of that costume, however, had to be the mask, all white with a blood-red sphere in the center up there. The warrior that had spotted him instantly shouted out as all of them got into a formation, preparing for an enemy ambush. Ken then jumped down, his armor and blades clattering a bit, sounding a lot like a wind chime more than anything. "State your business," one of the samurai said, hoping that they wouldn't have to face the person in front of him. "Can you please die silently?" Ken asked as he tilted his head slightly. His young voice startled many of the soldiers. His mannerisms could have even been called cute, had the situation been different. As soon as he said that, some of the men reeled back, showing a slight gap in the formation. That was the exact second Ken dashed forward, the wind rolling around him as he brought his long blade around and slashed at the men mercilessly. The blade flared with blue light as electricity seemed to sparkle around it. The first swipe mowed through 3 people and 3 blades before it was stopped by the 4th. The 3 were all split in the middle section, their torsos flying upwards as their swords snapped and fell to the ground. The soldiers instantly panicked when seeing 3 of their own fall so quickly, but they still had training. All of the remaining members still rushed Ken, while the one blocking his strike tried to keep his attention. Ken didn't show any reaction to this, as it was the obvious move to make. The remaining 6 warriors seemed to circle around him perfectly in the second that Ken had given them his breathing room. "I need to give them some leeway, otherwise I wouldn't be able to test this blade for long." Still, Ken quickly split the 4th sword apart, shocking the samurai that had been holding it as Ken slightly pulled his blade backwards as it passed through the man's torso. Instead of being cut in half, the man was simply gutted alive. Ken instantly twirled around, raising the hilt of the sword to block a sword slash, and twisting his body around its blade to block another. His leg raised up and kicked the hand of another warrior, breaking his fingers and making him drop his sword. Ken then kicked the sword while it was still falling, shooting it a bit upwards, and then kicked it again right into the stunned man's throat. More blades were rushing in as Ken decided that blocking all of them was becoming annoying. Instead of bothering to block them, he raised himself on the hilt of his blade, standing on one arm as the thirst that had been directed towards him all passed by the blade. Ken then twirled around the sword, using it as a pole, and kicking two of the men backwards. Then, with one hand grabbing the hilt of the sword, he kicked it with his leg, causing it to shoot upwards and throw some dust into the samurai that had been behind him. As the blade was going up, Ken put his other hand on it as well, bringing it down onto the warrior in front of him. The man only had the time to bring up his sword in order to try and block it, but he truly had no chance. This time, Ken didn't even bother with chakra, as his blade simply cut through the katana almost instantly, splitting the man in two with a downward slash. A monster. The two warriors that Ken had kicked away had already got up. Both of them seemed to have the same idea as they turned around and started running. Ken simply picked up the two sides of the blade he had just broken and threw them at their back, hitting them perfectly, feeling them hit the ground with a small thud. At that point, the man he had blinded had also managed to rub the dust and snow out of his eyes, only to see that he was the last man alive. Wait, please don't kill me. The man instantly got on his knees, knowing that he truly had no chance of fighting whatever the thing in front of him was. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Yet Ken said with childlike joy in his voice, as he once again tilted his head a bit and brought his sword behind him, stabbing it on the ground and leaning on the dull part, while crossing his arms a bit. Thank you. The warrior instantly banged his head on the ground a few times. All honor was forgotten in the face of death, it seemed. You're welcome. By the way, can you tell me more about your mission? Ken asked as he continued to sense the man's heartbeat quicken with that question. Don't worry, I don't want anything with you or your lord. Can you tell me a bit more about the men that killed the mountain bandits here? Ken decided to rephrase his question, and he could feel the man calm down quite a lot after he had done so. Of course. The man instantly started giving Ken more information regarding the 7 swordsmen of the mist. Ken simply smiled under his mask as he heard more of that information. Ken smiled as he walked, his long blade already sheathed and on his back. Behind him could be seen a headless corpse, a bit further away from 8 other corpses, and another pile of burnt corpses. The cleanup crew wasn't going to be having much fun. That much was for sure. It wasn't like Ken felt good killing the soldiers, but to him, none of them was all that innocent anyway. Ken also knew that he needed to kill them in order to keep his identity a secret. There wasn't much else to it. The men had come into his home and destroyed it, and he killed them all in return. The ease with which he had done it was a bit strange, but Ken knew that it was just because he was already extremely used to killing others. He had told himself that he would be different in his new life, that he wouldn't give in to his vices so easily. It wasn't difficult for him to control himself when his family took care of him, but it seemed that he was bound to slip into some of his old habits without them. Ken was well aware of that, but this time things were a bit different. Unlike before, when he killed people without a care in the world, now his mind seemed to wander in different directions. These men, each and every one of them could have had families. I may have been technically defending myself, but I still willingly tore away someone precious to someone else. It wasn't like Ken was going to stop killing people, not as long as the group called the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist was still alive. But now he knew by experience what effects loss could have on humans. He used to laugh at the people that came after him for revenge at some point in his life, for he simply found it difficult to sympathize with them. It was rather ironic that he was now also out seeking revenge for the lives of his family. So Ken decided to make a promise, a vow, to the corpses of his family before he finally left the mountain range, before he ventured into the wide world of one day. I find my hands sullied with innocent blood once more. I will plunge my blade into my stomach and gut myself on the spot. Ken knew that not killing others was going to be difficult in the world he had been sent into, but he now vowed to only kill in order to survive, to only kill those that truly deserved to die. Unlike in his past life, where he killed for pleasure and gratification, this time he was doing it with purpose. It didn't matter that he slightly enjoyed it still, as long as he didn't harm anyone other than his enemies. After that vow, Ken proceeded to walk down the mountain. Thanks to the interrogation from the warrior he had decapitated, he now knew the identity of his targets, where they came from. He knew where he would find them, but finding them wasn't going to be the difficult part. The 7 of them seemed to always move as a squad, so in order to chase after them and slaughter them, Ken needed to grow a lot stronger. Thankfully, at 8 years of age, he still had a lot of room for growth, as his growth had only just started. Ken had interrogated the man from earlier about various things, including exactly how powerful shinobi could be, and the way to tell them from one another. The warrior didn't seem all that knowledgeable himself, but he still knew a lot more than Ken, as Daisuke had yet to get to teach him much about the power levels of other shinobi. Ken had a benchmark for Jonin, with the Hatamoto and the 7 swordsmen, but the rest of the lower rankings had been a mystery to him. The samurai was able to put things into perspective for Ken. Most people specialized in 1 or 2 areas, and each person was ranked on the degree of mastery or skill in the area they specialized in. The 9 samurai that Ken had killed were all at genin level, capable of taking on chunins as long as they were in groups of 3. thanks to their trained swordsmanship and formations. They couldn't do much against someone both stronger and more skilled than them though. Currently, Ken was physically at the level of a chunin, while being more skilled in battle than the majority of jonin out there. His energy reserves were also decent, easily entering the levels of chunin, being in the higher brackets when it came to density. Ken tried to ask about the second energy within him, that was somehow related to nature, but the samurai seemed to have no idea what Ken was talking about. Still, Ken knew that his enhanced physical strength was thanks to that energy. Ken had noticed that he was able to use it to replenish his stamina as well. The energy was recharged automatically as his body absorbed more from the air around him, which would eventually lead to Ken having endless stamina, when his chakra reserves were large enough to balance a larger amount of nature energy. Ken had already done a few tests in his travels. He could run and remain energized for a few days on end, without even feeling the need to stop. Well, he still stopped to eat or drink a bit of water, but his muscles simply didn't seem tired at all. Ken also found that depleting his chakra reserves was a rather good way of expanding them. It was a slow process, but it seemed rather efficient compared to doing nothing. Unfortunately, Ken didn't have any method of depleting his chakra efficiently. Using chakra flow didn't deplete a lot of it either, as the technique formed something akin to a closed circuit, flowing the chakra from his body into his blade and back. This was the method that Ken had devised in order to save as much as possible while he was younger. It was the only way he knew how to perform chakra flow. If anyone were to hear about it, they'd be beyond shocked that a child would be able to come up with something like that. But to Ken, it was just normal, as he didn't know how the technique usually went. Ken spent more and more time in between mountain ranges, training like a madman for a while. At least until he was confident enough to venture out in the world to be prepared for most situations that might arise. Eventually, during the weeks he spent in the forest training, Ken managed to create a move that depleted his chakra rather efficiently. He had been aiming to find a method to increase his chakra depletion rate. He figured creating a new technique wouldn't hurt. Copying the Hatamoto he had assassinated, he coated his blade in a thick coat of lighting, with wind flowing all around it. Slowly but surely, he poured more and more chakra into the blade, making it sparkle with light as the wind bent around it violently. Ken then proceeded to add nature energy into the mix, which seemed to strengthen the technique even more. Then, with both of his hands on the oversized blade, he spun around, arms firmly holding the blade as he released a powerful slash all around him. The surrounding forest trembled as trees were blown away. Ken himself was glad he didn't have eyes, as he was sure they would have been filled with dust. The technique name, Dragon Twister. It was simple, and it had everything to do with the state of the forest around him when he performed that attack for the first time. Everything around him was torn apart as if a tornado had gone through. The attack ruined everything around him in a 10 to 20 meter radius. The dragon part in the name came from the fact that he remembered Daisuke reading him legends about mythical animals and such, and he remembered clearly that it was his favorite mythical beast. Ken was satisfied with its strength, but he didn't quite like how slow it was. It had taken him an entire minute to flow chakra into his blade and mix in his nature energy. It wasn't a short process, and it required a lot of concentration. In an actual battle, such a move simply wasn't usable. In terms of depleting chakra, it sure did its job though. It took around half of Ken's reserves to perform it once. So, Ken decided that he would at the very least perfect the technique before heading out into the world. This would in turn only make him stronger, both in body and chakra reserves. Ken was prepared to camp for a while in that place. Good thing he even had a waterfall nearby, underneath which was a large lake which went rather deep. Ken instantly decided on a training method, submerging himself in the deepest point of the lake and performing that technique twice, before climbing back up and trying to split open the waterfall with a flying slash. And so, the training began. And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part, so be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching, we'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out my other anime videos.